Welcome to the world of money. Bread, cash, dosh, dough, loot, lucre, mullah, the readies, the wherewithal. Call it what you like. Money can make us, or it can break us. In the past year, it's certainly broken more than a few of the biggest names on Wall Street and in the other financial capitals of the world. And while former masters of the universe crash and burn, the rest of us are left worrying if our savings would be safer in a mattress than in a bank.
The great financial crisis that began in the summer of 2007 has most of us utterly baffled. How on earth could a little local difficulty with subprime mortgages in the United States unleash an economic tsunami big enough to obliterate some of Wall Street's most illustrious names, to force nationalizations of banks on both sides of the Atlantic, and to bring the entire world economy to the very brink of recession, if not downright depression?
Perhaps this film should be called The Descent of Money. In just 7 days' time, a new president will take office. A president who campaigned on a promise to end a financial crisis, which since his election has only got worse. I've spent the past 2 years making a series about the history of finance, which you'll see on PBS in a few months. But in this program, I want to tell you about the causes of this crisis, possibly the greatest threat to our prosperity since the 1930s.
Funding for The Ascent of Money.
Even after the onset of this crisis, the amount of money still sloshing around planet finance boggles the mind. By one measure, the US stock of money is now $8.7 trillion, up 12% since last year. And some people are still pocketing a huge share of that cash. Last year, despite the onset of the biggest financial crisis since the Depression, his hedge fund paid George Soros a cool $2.4 billion. That's roughly 41,000 times more than the average American family earned.
Of course, it was like when you're betting and you win, naturally you have that satisfaction and also the profit.
As they say on Wall Street, way to go. But what is this thing called money anyway? The answer is simple. It's the tangible expression of the relationship between lender and borrower, creditor and debtor. A relationship built on trust. And whether money takes the form of silver coins, seashells, bars of gold, or banknotes, that's been true from ancient times right down to the present day. Even lumps of clay can work better than silver coins if people have enough confidence in them. In ancient Mesopotamia, nearly 4,000 years ago, people used clay tablets like these ones to commit themselves to particular financial transactions. For example, this one, found a little southwest of Baghdad, specifies that a debtor will repay a lender 330 measures of grain on the harvest day. But this one's even more fascinating, because what it says is that a debt of 4 measures of barley should be repaid to the bearer of the clay tablet. And it's that idea of repayment to the bearer that really fascinates me. If the phrase sounds familiar, then it should. Just take a look at a £20 note. Banknotes have next to no intrinsic worth. They're simply promises to pay, just like the clay tablets of ancient Babylon 4 millennia ago. On the back of the $10 bill, it says, "In God we trust." But it's not really God you're trusting in.
By swapping your goods or your labor for a fistful of these things, you're trusting the US Treasury Secretary not to produce so many of the damn things that by the time you come to spend them, they're worth even less than the paper they're printed on.
This issue of confidence isn't just financial theory. It's real. The whole of our economic system is built on it, as are the decisions of its overlords, like ex-chairman of the Federal Reserve and now economic advisor to President-elect Obama, Paul Volcker.
If people have confidence in something that doesn't cost much to manufacture, namely a piece of paper with some printing on it, and so long as people have confidence in that piece of paper that it's going to maintain its value, and it maintains its value because people are willing to accept it, it's all a kind of, not a con game, but it's a confidence game. There's no question it's a confidence game. You have confidence in whatever it is, and it's convenient, it's divisible, easily held, makes good money.
Today, we're quite happy with paper money. Even more amazingly, we're happy with money we can't even see. Millions of dollars pass through this woman's hands every day. Or rather, across her computer screen. She's a foreign exchange dealer whose business is literally buying and selling money. Each day, around $3 trillion changes hands in transactions like these around the world. And it's all built on trust. It has to be when you can't even touch the stuff. There was one huge possibility created by the emergence of money as a system of mutual trust. A possibility that would revolutionize world history. It was the idea that you could rely on people to borrow money from you and pay it back at some future date. That's why the root of credit is credo, the Latin for I believe. Without the invention of credit, the entire economic history of our world would have been impossible.
Because we take it for granted, we tend to underestimate the extent to which our entire civilization is based on the borrowing and lending of money. Now, it doesn't literally make the world go round, but it does make vast quantities of people, goods, and services go around the world, from Babylon to Bolivia.
The provision of credit has underpinned the transformation of a planet of subsistence farmers into a globalized economy worth tens of trillions of dollars. The idea has been with us for centuries. But nowhere was the credit business further advanced by the 16th century than Venice.
And the home of literature's most notorious moneylender, Shylock, in William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice.
May you stead me? Will you pleasure me? Shall I know your answer?
Crucially, Shylock's only prepared to lend the money if Bassanio's friend, the merchant Antonio, is providing the security.
3,000 ducats for 3 months, and Antonio bound.
Your answer to that?
Antonio is a good man.
By good, Shylock doesn't mean virtuous. He means good for the money he's about to lend Bassanio. In other words, creditworthy.
Have you heard any imputation to the contrary?
Oh, no. My reason in saying that he is a good man is to have you understand me that he is sufficient. 3,000 ducats. I think I may take his bond.
With any loan, things can go wrong, ships can sink. And that is precisely why anyone who lends money to a merchant, if only for the duration of an ocean voyage, needs to be compensated. We usually call the compensation interest, the amount paid to the lender over and above the sum lent, or principal. Overseas trade of the sort that Venice depended on couldn't operate without such transactions, and they remain the foundation of international trade to this day. But why does Shylock turn out to be such a villain, demanding literally a pound of flesh, in effect Antonio's death, if he can't fulfill his obligations? Why is Shakespeare's moneylender so heartless, the original of that financier who recurs time and again in Western literature? One clue is that Shylock is one of the many Jewish moneylenders in history. Jews who stayed in Venice for more than 2 weeks were supposed to wear a yellow O on their backs or a yellow hat, and they were confined to a special area which became known as the Ghetto Nuovo.
This is the entrance to the Jewish ghetto in Venice, where Jews were obliged to live and indeed confined at night. Jews were tolerated in Venice, but for a reason.
The key was that Jews could provide a service that Christian merchants were forbidden to do. They could charge interest on their loans.
This is where the Venetian Jews used to do business. This building here was the old Banco Rosso, and it was outside here that they used to sit, behind their tables, their tavole, on their benches, their banchi, the root of the Italian word for banks. Now, there was a good reason why merchants came here to the Jewish ghetto to borrow money. For Christians, what the Jews were doing, lending money at interest, was a sin.
The medieval church's laws against usury, charging interest on loans, were a major obstacle to the development of finance in Europe. After all, what God-fearing Christian merchant wished to risk the torments of hell? There, the moneylenders were eternally tortured with scorching earth and freezing snow, their necks weighed down with bulging purses.
But it was in another Italian city-state, Florence, that the key financial service of providing credit moved out of the ghetto and away from the gates of hell to become the legitimate preserve of banks. It was a transition symbolized by the rise of one family, the Medici.
With their ascent, credit came of age. Money lending ceased to be disreputable. It became glorious, and the foundation of a new kind of power. The dazzling legacy of the Medici family's power still surrounds you in Florence today. In the space of 400 years, 2 Medici became queens of France, 3 became pope. Appropriately, it was Machiavelli, the supreme theorist of power, who wrote their history. Perhaps no other family left such an imprint on an age as the Medici left on the Renaissance. You might even say that they paid for the Renaissance, their patronage running the gamut of genius from Michelangelo to Galileo. Nothing could better illustrate the extraordinary ascent of money. For what the Medici had achieved was nothing less than the birth of modern banking.
For 500 years, few things in economic life have mattered more than the ability of individuals, companies, and governments to borrow from banks. As we are discovering today, when the banking system breaks down, things can go very wrong indeed. You could say that the United States has been built on borrowed money. Until recently, at least, American banks were willing to give just about anyone a loan.
Memphis is famous for blue suede shoes, barbecued ribs, and bankruptcies. You can tell people here are a little, how shall I say this, a little subprime.
You only need to look at the ubiquitous shopping mall for the seriously poor, not to mention the no-frills eatery.
Then there's a tax advisor who can tell you how to claim your low-income credits. A shop where you can borrow money on the equity you own in your car. And a place where they'll give you an advance on next week's paycheck. Not to mention a pawn shop the size of a department store.
And finally, when you've no possessions left to pawn or to sell, there's just one option left, and that's to head on down to ZLB Plasma, where you can sell your own blood for $25 a pop. Talk about being bled dry. It's amazing, really, an entire economic sector based on people who are broke.
For a time, American banks even seem to have solved the problem that has bedeviled money lending since the earliest times. How to make money when so many low-income debtors renege on their obligations.
This is Richie. He's in the repo business, snatching cars from under their owners' noses when they haven't made their payments.
And he grabbed that bolt action and went, and I watched the rifle shell go into the barrel. And he lunged it towards me and hit me right here and almost knocked me down. He said, either you drop the truck or I'm dropping you. And I said, yes, sir. And I dropped the truck.
You know, you make it sound so attractive. Maybe I should switch jobs.
I'll tell you what, it's interesting.
In the bankruptcy capital of America, repossessing cars is a routine matter.
Down 5, he's pretty good down 6, 36, 16,000 average book, gentlemen, with the ads on it now. It's got the ads, the wheels, the leather, the top.
Each week, United Auto Recoveries sells 500 repossessed cars. The cars are auctioned off to the trade, ending up in the same car lots to be sold to much the same people, and when they can't keep up with their monthly payments, repoed and recycled once again.
Technically, the Memphis repo men are simply doing what debt collectors do the world over. The difference, apart from the sheer mind-boggling scale of the thing, is the relative ease with which the bad debts are wound up and the collateral is sold off.
Here in Tennessee, when the house has been stripped bare and the repo man has taken your car, you end up in the hands of one of Memphis's bankruptcy lawyers, along with around 13,000 other people who filed for bankruptcy here in the past year.
Because that's what's one thing that's making your payments up so high.
Every week, bankrupts gather here with their lawyers to hammer out deals with their creditors. There's even a fast-track lane.
In this case, it's a mortgage, and it's a car or two cars. I can't see anything else in there that they're having to pay off.
Actually, there are 3 cars.
3 cars.
Yeah, third car is the neighborhood title loans has a lien on that car. They are holding the title.
So, putting this really simply, what were they supposed to be paying, and what are they now paying? Okay.
So that payment was reduced from $241.11 down to $107.
Okay.
Quite an improvement.
Cutting your monthly obligations by more than half.
From 1996 to 2006, there were between 1 and 2 million bankruptcy cases a year in the United States, nearly all of them involving individuals who elected to go bust rather than meet their obligations. In medieval Italy, or in the Glasgow of my youth for that matter, bankruptcy was seen as a disaster. But not here.
In fact, this ability to walk away unscathed from unsustainable debt and start all over again has been a defining characteristic of American capitalism. There were no debtors' prisons here in the early 1800s, at a time when English debtors could languish in jail for years. Since 1898, every American has been entitled to file for Chapter 7, liquidation, or Chapter 13, voluntary personal reorganization. For rich and poor alike, bankruptcy has become as much of an inalienable right as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
The theory is that American law exists to encourage entrepreneurship, to facilitate the creation of new businesses. And that means giving people a break when things don't work out the first time or even the second time. The born risk-takers don't get wiped out as they learn through trial and error how to make that first million. Because today's bankrupt might be tomorrow's billionaire. It's a theory that seems to work. Many of America's greatest successes failed in their endeavors, including the author Mark Twain, the comedian Buster Keaton, and none other than the great industrialist Henry Ford himself. All of these men eventually flourished, not least because they were given a chance to try, fail, and start over. For their part, the banks simply assume that a proportion of the loans they make will go bad. After all, most people going bankrupt owe relatively trivial sums. And Chapter 13 doesn't wipe their debts out. It just reschedules them.
But wait, I hear you ask. If banks are so used to dealing with bankruptcy, how could so many have collapsed so spectacularly in the past year, throwing the financial world into turmoil?
To understand why bad debts in places like Memphis could cause such chaos, you need to understand how the relationship between banks and borrowers broke down as loans came to be securitized and sold on to unwary investors. Which brings us to the epicenter of this crisis, the real estate market. It's the English-speaking world's favorite game, property. And today, the stakes in the game are higher than ever. The original property game we know today as Monopoly was actually invented back in 1903 to expose the unfairness of a social system where a small minority of landlords screwed the majority of tenants. 30 years later, an unemployed plumber named Charles Darrow patented a new version of the game, with the board based on the streets here in Atlantic City. It was Darrow who introduced the little houses and hotels.
What the game of Monopoly tells us, contrary to its inventor's intentions, is that it's smart to own property. And if it's smart to own property, it's even smarter to lend money to the people who own property. That's because the phrase safe as houses has a rather special meaning in the world of finance. What it means is that there's nothing safer than to lend money to people who own real estate. Why? Well, because if they default on the loan, you can always repossess the property. Even if they run away, the house can't.
What's more, the English-speaking world's obsession with property has been the foundation for a unique economic and political experiment, the property-owning democracy. Some say it's a model the whole world should adopt. The growth of property ownership gave rise to a new era in the history of finance. On the back of property, literally trillions of dollars have been borrowed, some of it by so-called subprime borrowers, people who'd previously been content to rent rather than own their homes. So it's come as rather a shock to millions of people that real estate is fundamentally no different from any other financial asset. Its price can go down as well as up. It turns out that no amount of financial alchemy can turn little suburban boxes into treasure chests with roofs. Which raises the question, is property really as safe as houses?
Or could it be that we've let our love affair with real estate get completely out of proportion? An Englishman's home is his castle, and Americans know that there's no place like home too, even if all the homes are rather similar.
Today, we take the universal right to own our own home for granted. But before the 1930s, no more than 2/5 of American households were owner-occupiers. If the old class system based on elite property ownership was distinctively British, the revolution that created a new property-owning democracy was born out of a great American financial crisis. When the Depression struck in 1929, the US economy nosedived. The minority of people who did own their own homes couldn't afford the mortgage payments. Tenants, too, struggled to pay the rent when all they had coming in was the dole. Nowhere were the effects of the Depression more painful than in Detroit. Soon the automobile industry here employed only half the number of workers it had in 1929, and at half the wages. By 1932, the dispossessed of Detroit had had enough. On March the 7th, 5,000 workers laid off by the Ford Motor Company marched to the factory to demand unemployment relief. What followed would force Americans to completely rethink their attitude to property ownership. As the unarmed crowd reached Gate 4 of the company's River Rouge plant in Dearborn, scuffles broke out. Suddenly, the factory gates opened and a phalanx of police and security men rushed out and fired into the crowd. Five workers were killed. Days later, 60,000 people sang the Internationale at their funeral. The Communist Party newspaper accused Edsel Ford, son of the firm's founder, Henry, of allowing a massacre. Could anything be done to defuse what was beginning to seem like a revolutionary situation, pitting the seriously propertied Fords against their propertyless ex-employees? In a remarkable gesture of conciliation, Edsel Ford turned to a Mexican artist named Diego Rivera. He invited him to paint a mural that would show Detroit's economy as a site of cooperation, not class conflict.
Diego Rivera was a lifelong communist. His ideal was of a society in which there would be no private property, in which the means of production would be commonly owned. In his eyes, Ford's River Rouge plant was the very opposite, a capitalist society in which the workers worked and the property owners, who reaped the rewards of their efforts, merely watched.
When the murals were unveiled in 1933, the city's dignitaries were appalled. They saw them as communist propaganda, a travesty on the spirit of Detroit.
The power of art is a wonderful thing, but it was clearly going to take something rather more powerful than art to heal a society so deeply split by the Depression. Other countries turned to the extremes of totalitarianism, but in the United States, the answer was the New Deal, and that included a New Deal on housing. In radically increasing the number of Americans who could hope to own their own homes, the Roosevelt administration pioneered the idea of a property-owning democracy. It proved to be the perfect antidote to Red Revolution.
In effect, the government would rig the housing market to incentivize Americans to become property owners. Customers at local mortgage lenders, known as savings and loans, would have their deposits guaranteed by the government, even if a bank went bust. Crucially, a new federal housing administration was set up to offer larger, longer, and lower interest loans. After the 1930s, most mortgages in the United States were fixed for 20 or 30 years. A new Federal National Mortgage Association, nicknamed Fannie Mae, was set up to create a nationwide market for home loans.
This couple is going through a model house now. The husband apparently isn't very keen about it all, but his wife is entranced by such convenient features as the sturdy built-in ironing board.
By reducing the monthly cost of a mortgage, these reforms made home ownership possible for many more Americans than ever before.
They both would like to have this place for their very own. Too bad they can't afford it. Ah, but maybe they can. For according to this sign, they can buy this house with monthly payments that are less than they now spend for rent.
It's not too much to say that the modern United States, with its seductively samey suburbs, was born out of these New Deal reforms.
From the 1930s then, the US government effectively underwrote the mortgage market, bringing borrowers and lenders together. And that was the reason for the big explosion in property ownership and mortgage debt in the decades after World War II. There was just one catch. Not everyone in American society had an invitation to the property-owning party.
When these houses were built in Detroit back in 1941, whether you got the money or not for a mortgage depended on which side of this divide you lived.
It was a real estate developer who built this 6-foot-high wall right through the middle of Detroit's 8-mile district. He had to build it in order to qualify for loans from the Federal Housing Administration. The loans were to be given for construction on that side of the wall, which was a predominantly white neighborhood. On this side, on the black side, there was to be no federal credit, because African Americans were regarded as fundamentally uncreditworthy.
It was part of a system that divided the whole city, in theory by credit rating, in practice by color. Segregation, in other words, wasn't accidental, but a direct consequence of federal policy.
This map by the Federal Home Loan Board shows the predominantly black areas of Detroit, the Lower East Side, and so-called colonies like the one we're in now in Burwood Griggs, marked with the letter D and coloured red. You can see why the practice of giving whole neighbourhoods a negative credit rating came to be known as redlining. The result was that when people from around here needed mortgages, they had to pay significantly higher interest rates than the folks in the white part of town.
Half a century later, the two categories of borrowers would come to be known euphemistically as prime and subprime. But in the 1960s, this divide was the hidden financial dimension of the civil rights struggle. Blacks were to be excluded from the new property-owning society. There would be a heavy price to pay for this exclusion. On July the 23rd, 1967, property in Detroit literally went up in flames.
4 days of rioting, looting, and arson rocked the city of Detroit in the worst outbreak of urban racial violence this year.
Anger at economic discrimination spilled over into 5 days of rioting that left 43 people dead. Significantly, most of the violence was directed not against people, but against property. Nearly 3,000 buildings were looted or burned. The real lesson for policymakers was that excluding ethnic minorities from the property-owning democracy was a fast track to trouble. To make people feel like stakeholders in the social status quo, you had to make them property owners. Indeed, widening home ownership might even turn the malcontents into conservatives.
When this wall was built in the 1940s to divide white homeowners from black renters, African American families found it far more difficult to get mortgages.
60 years later, that had all changed. We want everybody in America to own their own home, President George W. Bush declared in October 2002, challenging lenders to create 5.5 million new minority homeowners by the end of the decade. Positively encouraged by the federal government to relax lending standards, mortgage companies swarmed into areas like this one, offering all kinds of alluring deals. Because so many of the new borrowers had patchy credit histories, these loans came to be known as subprime. No income, no job, no assets. That made you a perfect candidate for a ninja loan. The problem was that behind low introductory payments, these new mortgage loans were very different from the old 30-year fixed-rate repayment loans of the past.
Since the 1980s, the housing game has radically changed throughout the English-speaking world. Mortgages are for shorter and shorter durations, and more borrowers are opting for interest-only mortgages. That makes households far more sensitive than they used to be to interest rate hikes.
So how come the lenders didn't worry that these subprime borrowers were almost certain to default if interest rates rose? The answer to that question, and the key to the subprime crisis, was another S word: securitization.
Instead of putting their own money at risk, subprime lenders immediately sold the loans on to banks here in and around Wall Street. And the banks then securitized the loans, which means they bundled them together and then sliced and diced them so that at least the top tier could be classified as AAA-rated investment-grade securities. And the banks then sold these securities to investors 1,000 miles away from Detroit, who were happy to pay for just a few extra hundredths of a percentage point in interest.
No one is better qualified to comment on the risks of trading such complex securities than the hedge fund king, George Soros.
At the same time, markets were deregulated and innovation was allowed. And you created new synthetic instruments, CDOs and CSOs and all the alphabet soup of synthetic instruments. And they were all designed on this false conception of that markets tend towards equilibrium and deviations are random, which is false. But nevertheless, that was the basis on which these CDOs were designed, and they were given AAA rating.
The key to securitization was the distance between the mortgage borrowers in, say, Detroit, and the people who ended up receiving their interest payments. By the time small towns in Norway bought these securities, they had no idea what was really behind their investment.
The idea that you go to different people who have different desires for long-term securities, short-term securities, safe securities, risky securities, and somehow it's all going to come together and satisfy both the borrowers and the lenders. That was the theory.
Financial alchemy? Well, it was a business model that worked beautifully as long as interest rates stayed low, people kept their jobs, and real estate prices continued to rise.
Unfortunately, none of these things happened in Detroit. In 2006 alone, subprime lenders injected more than $1 billion into those areas of the city where home values were already falling and unemployment and mortgage rates were already rising.
Because prices were going up, people were willing to lend. And they were willing to lend on increasingly flimsy documentation. They didn't bother to ask in the end what your income was in some cases, or what your credit history was, and what the value of the house was.
Where Detroit led, other cities soon followed.
It's Thursday at noon, and I'm witnessing a twice-daily ritual here on the steps of the Memphis courthouse. About 30 homes are about to be auctioned off here, and the reason is that the mortgage lenders have foreclosed on the homeowners for failing to keep up with their interest payments.
2926 South Radford Avenue.
Memphis is really becoming foreclosure city these days. In the past 5 years, something like 1 in 4 households has received a notice threatening them with foreclosure.
Since the subprime mortgage market began to turn sour in the early summer of 2007, shockwaves have been spreading through all the world's financial markets, obliterating venerable investment banks and costing the survivors hundreds of billions of dollars. Remember that pillar of the 1930s New Deal mortgage market, Fannie Mae? With its younger brother, Freddie Mac, it grew to own or guarantee around half of all American home loans. In September 2008, Fannie and Freddie were effectively nationalized to avoid a complete collapse of the mortgage market. Established Wall Street names like Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and Merrill Lynch have vanished. And unlike previous property crises, this one extends right around the world. The 4 Norwegian municipalities of Rana, Hemnes, Hattfjelldal and Narvik, which had invested their citizens' taxes in subprime-backed securities, are now sitting on an investment worth roughly 15% of what they paid for it, a loss of $100 million.
In the English-speaking world, we tend to think of property as a one-way bet. Simplest way of getting rich is to play the property market. In fact, you'd be a mug to invest your money in anything else.
But the remarkable thing about this supposed truth is how often reality gives it the lie. For like stock markets, property can soar in value, only to crash in the most spectacular way. In Britain, between 1989 and 1995, the average house price fell by 18%. But that was nothing compared with what happened here in Japan.
Yeah, the view's good. Very Austin Powers decor. I'm loving that. Oh, that's the boiler. Okay, well, let's cut to the chase. How much is this place going to cost if I put the money down now?
So that would be close to $2 million.
Okay, that's like a million pounds buys me this
bijou apartment in Tokyo, but this is a smart neighborhood, right?
That may sound like a lot, but in recent Japanese history, it's a real bargain. Between 1985 and 1990, property prices in Japan rose by a factor of roughly 3. Banks fell over themselves to ride this wave. But it wasn't a wave, it was a bubble. And in 1990, it burst. Prices here in Tokyo fell by 75%, wiping out all the previous gains.
This has cost £1 million now. How much did it cost back in 1990 at the peak of the property bubble?
So roughly 3 times.
Three
value.
times?
So close to possibly $6 million.
£3 million. Wow. You know, we think we've had a property crash in the West, but this is a real property crash. So no, property isn't a uniquely safe investment. House prices can go down as well as up. And as assets go, houses are pretty illiquid, which means you can't unload them in a hurry if you get into a financial jam. And that pretty much is the downside of the idea of a property-owning democracy.
Now, ask yourself, what happens when banks construct a huge inverted pyramid of securities on top of the fragile foundation of the US subprime mortgage market? When that market tanks, the securities go down with it. And so do the companies who were foolish enough to invest their money in those securities, beginning with the banks. All of which helps to explain why a credit crunch would sooner or later be followed by a stock market crash as investors dump the stocks of companies exposed to the subprime meltdown. And that tells us something very important about the way companies and stock markets function and malfunction. Some people today say that companies, and particularly multinational corporations, rule the world. It's pretty hard to believe that any kind of human organization could tame the vast natural barriers of South America. But one company believed it could. By constructing a $1.5 billion gas pipeline from Bolivia right across the South American continent to the Atlantic coast of Brazil. By running gas along the longest pipeline in the world, 4,000 miles from the tip of Patagonia to the Argentine capital, Buenos Aires.
Such schemes exemplify the vaulting ambition of modern capitalism, but they're only possible because of one invention, the joint stock company.
But the ability of the company to transform our lives would depend on another innovation. The stock market. The price that people are prepared to pay for a company's shares in the market tells you how much money they think it'll make in the future. But as we've discovered in recent months of financial turmoil, stock markets can also be shock markets.
The future is always uncertain, but we human beings are prone to over-optimism. When prices here on the New York Stock Exchange surge upwards in sync, it's as if investors are gripped by a kind of collective euphoria, what the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, once famously called irrational exuberance. So stock markets really can be like soap bubbles. We never quite know when they're going to burst.
The exuberance was especially irrational, and the burst especially painful for the company that proposed those vast projects in Latin America. Enron became the biggest corporate fraud in modern American history.
But Enron was very far from the only corporate scam since shares were first bought and sold 400 years ago. And the shady practices it epitomized live on. Indeed, they've been a key cause of the financial crisis we're living through now. Cooked books? Stock prices rigged? Been there, done that, for centuries. Nothing illustrates more clearly than the history of stock market bubbles how hard human beings find it to learn from history. Stock market crashes are nothing new. Hidden away among the many splendors of Venice is a small clue to one of the most astonishing tales of adventure in all financial history.
To the honour and memory of John Law of Edinburgh, most distinguished controller of the treasury of the kings of the French. This is the final resting place of the man who invented the stock market bubble. An ambitious Scot, a convicted murderer, a compulsive gambler, and a flawed financial genius, he not only caused the first true boom and bust in asset prices, he also indirectly caused the French Revolution.
There was a time when John Law owned a quarter of what is now the United States, only to lose it all in history's first great crash. From Edinburgh to Amsterdam to Paris, all the way here to New Orleans, and finally to Venice, Law's story is a classic tale of boom and bust. It's also very much a story for our own times.
Hidden away here in the warehouse of the Louisiana State Museum is the only known painting of John Law. Here he is. With that lean and hungry look, he really is for all the world a Scotsman on the make.
John Law's plan had been to restructure the French economy and make his fortune by selling shares in a company, the Mississippi Company, trading with the new French territory of Louisiana. Yet all Law succeeded in doing was to blow up the entire French financial system, while the Louisiana of his investors' dreams turned out to be a mosquito-infested swamp. This was the first stock market bubble in history, but it was by no means the largest. When we think of stock market bubbles, we think of this.
The nightmare that haunts the world of finance, which has returned to haunt us in the last few months, is that there could ever be a bust to match the Great Wall Street crash, which began on October the 24th, 1929, Black Thursday. Over the next 3 years, the US stock market declined a staggering 86%, reaching its nadir in June 1932. What was worse, this asset price deflation was accompanied by the worst depression in all history. In the United States, output collapsed by nearly a third. Unemployment reached a quarter of the civilian labor force. Why did the 1929 crash happen? Why, indeed, does any crash happen? This remains one of the most hotly debated questions in financial history. There are all kinds of technical explanations for stock market crashes, but at root, it's all about herd psychology. In a bull market, that's when share prices are rising, even the smartest investors can succumb to what the former chairman of the American Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, famously called irrational exuberance. But when the herd changes direction, sometimes in reaction to nothing more than a change in the wind, their mood can also change from euphoria to gloom. The herd stampedes.
One cow gets scared, and that fear just translates to the whole herd, and they all take off. And the rest of them don't know why they're scared. They just feel that fear, and they run. Fear overwhelms all rational thinking until it's over.
In market jargon, the buyers have turned into sellers, the bulls into bears.
Despite the zoological imagery, the point is that markets are mirrors of the human psyche. Like Homo sapiens, they're prone to mood swings, from greed to fear. They can suffer from depression, and sometimes they can experience complete breakdowns. That happens rather more often than some financial theories would lead you to expect, but not so often that we're ever quite ready for the next breakdown.
If movements in financial markets were statistically distributed like human heights, there would hardly be any crashes. Most months would be clustered around the average, with only a tiny number witnessing extreme ups or downs. Let's face it, not many of us are below 4 feet in height or above 8 feet.
This is the classic bell-shaped curve, where things are distributed according to their frequency, the most commonly occurring clustered here around the middle, and the relatively rare dwarves and giants out here at the extremes. That's why it's quite a steep curve, because most human heights are quite close to the average. But if you do the same thing for financial markets, for daily moves in the stock market, you end up with something that looks more like this, with relatively fewer small movements and relatively more big movements down or up. And these are what the statisticians mean when they talk about long or fat tails.
If stock market movements were distributed like human heights, a drop of 10% would happen only once every 500 years. And stock market crashes of 20% in a year would be unheard of, rather like people just 6 inches tall. Whereas in fact, there have been 7 such crashes in the past century. As it turned out, those who feared that the brief panic of October 1987 would turn into the next great crash were proved wrong. The market had one really bad month, then rallied. But that bubble provided a golden opportunity for corporate crookery.
What John Law's Mississippi Company had been to the bubble that launched the 18th century, so another company would be to the bubble that ended the 20th. It was a company that promised its investors wealth beyond the dreams of avarice. It was a company that claimed to have reinvented the entire financial system. And it was a company that used its impeccable political connections to ride all the way to the top of the bull market.
Named by Fortune magazine as America's most innovative company for 6 consecutive years, that company was Enron. 7 years after its collapse, most of us have consigned Enron to the dustbin of financial history. Yet it pioneered many of the dubious business practices that continue to plague us today. In the 3 years up to August 2000, shares of the Houston Energy Company had gone through the roof. Once a small-time gas company in Nebraska, Enron was now the 5th largest company in the United States, with stated revenues of $111 billion. Enron was the darling of Wall Street. Yet a little historical knowledge might have made Enron's investors think twice. Indeed, the story of Enron was like a rerun of the Mississippi bubble 280 years before. John Law's plan had been to revolutionize French government finance. Ken Lay, the chairman of Enron, planned to revolutionize the global energy business. For years, the industry had been dominated by huge utility companies, which both produced the energy, pumped the gas, and generated the electricity, and sold it on to consumers. Lay's big idea was to create a kind of energy bank, which would act as the intermediary between suppliers and consumers. His dream was to make Enron the greatest energy company in the world. Caught up in the heady spirit of the times was senior Enron executive Sharon Watkins.
It was very electric. You felt like you could, if you came up with a good idea, Enron would give you the money and you could go for it at a very young age.
Like John Law, Ken Lay had friends in high places. He contributed generously to George H.W. Bush's presidential campaign. As president, Bush duly pushed through legislation that deregulated the energy industry. Riding a global wave of energy privatization, Enron snapped up assets all over the world. In Latin America alone, the company had interests in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, where they laid a huge pipeline across the continent to Brazil.
And thanks to the intervention of Ken Lay's personal friend, George W. Bush, Enron was able to acquire a controlling stake in the largest natural gas pipeline network in the world, here in Argentina.
Above all, however, Enron traded, not only in energy, but in virtually all the ancient elements of earth, water, fire, and air. It even traded in internet bandwidth. Enron led a Wall Street surge unnervingly reminiscent of the Mississippi bubble. Despite his half-hearted warnings against irrational exuberance, this bull market was propelled upward by the chairman of the US Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan. As in John Law's time, a stock market bubble could only happen if money was abundant. And by raising interest rates only once between February 1995 and June 1999, Greenspan made sure that it was.
The rewards for investors were immense, and also for the managers here at the company's Houston headquarters, who were generously incentivized with share options. In the space of just 3 years after 1997, the Enron stock price rose by a factor of very nearly 5, from below $20 a share to above 90. It was the Mississippi Company all over again.
Even a city used to extravagant oil-fired living had seen nothing like it. This is where Ken Lay and his Enron executives used to live, in River Oaks, Houston's most exclusive neighborhood. In the final year of its existence, Enron paid its top 140 executives an average of $5.3 million each. Luxury car sales went through the roof.
You got multiples of your annual base pay. You were really less thought of if you got a percentage, even if it was 75% of your annual base pay. Oh, you were getting a percentage. You wanted multiples. You wanted 2 times your annual base pay, 3 times, 4 times your annual base pay as a bonus.
And Lay, the pillar of society, espoused the highest moral standards for his company.
Enron is a company that deals with everyone with absolute integrity. We play by all of the rules. We stand by our word. We mean what we say what we mean.
The only problem was that, like John Law's system, the Enron system was an elaborate fraud.
Hey, this is David up at Enron. There's not much demand for power at all, and we're running kind of fat.
In this tape, an Enron trader is discussing with the El Paso Electric Company how to hold California's consumers to ransom by closing power stations to restrict the supply of electricity.
If you took down the steamer, how long would it take to get it back up? 3 or 4 hours, something like that? Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, why don't you just go ahead and shut her down then, if that's okay? Okay.
The results were not only the higher prices Enron wanted, but also, despite there being plenty of power available, repeated blackouts for consumers. Enron's money was stolen in more ways than one. the company's stated assets were vastly inflated. But its key financial innovation was to remove its debts from the balance sheet and hide them in so-called special purpose entities. Dubious names like Chuco and Raptor. Each quarter, the company's executives had to use more smoke and more mirrors to make actual losses look like bumper profits. It couldn't last.
When you cook the books and then you try to hide it, you're toast.
When they sensed the game would soon be up, Lay and his cronies started to unload hundreds of millions of dollars worth of shares, while at the same time reassuring the public that the share price would continue to soar. Like John Law's desperate attempts to stem the free fall of Mississippi Company shares, all Ken Lay's reassurances were in vain. On November the 15th, 2001, Alan Greenspan, head of the US Federal Reserve, received the Enron Prize for Distinguished Public Service, adding his name to a roll of honor that included Mikhail Gorbachev and Nelson Mandela. Greenspan deserved it, because without his monetary policies in the late 90s, the Enron bubble and the dot-com bubble that coincided with it would surely have been impossible. Just 2 weeks after the award ceremony, Enron filed for bankruptcy. The company owed billions. But just how many billions?
When Enron declared bankruptcy, December 2001, they met with their creditors to say, guys, I know on our balance sheet we have reported $13 billion of long-term debt. Our true long-term debt picture is $38 billion. There's $25 billion in off-balance sheet debt.
Did those numbers come as a shock to you? You knew there were problems, but not on that scale.
Yes. I mean, I think we were all flabbergasted.
The day before 4,500 employees at Enron's HQ were given their marching orders, a final round of bonus checks were issued to grateful executives. In May 2006, Ken Lay was convicted on all 6 counts of securities and wire fraud. His sidekick, Jeffrey Skilling, was sentenced to 24 years in prison. Lay died before sentencing while on holiday in Aspen, Colorado. Yet the fraudulent practices that propelled Enron's rise and fall didn't die with Ken Lay. On the contrary, the habit of hiding debt off balance sheet that Enron pioneered subsequently spread throughout the Western financial system. The unraveling of this dodgy accounting has been a key component of the current crisis.
In many respects, I think the Enron problem was in a petri dish, and the germ has spread throughout the financial markets, some of which comes from Enron traders and finance folks that are gainfully employed at banks and energy trading houses. So that rot is everywhere in the financial markets.
The Joint Stock Limited Liability Company truly is a miraculous institution. And yet, throughout financial history, there have always been a few crooked companies, just as there have occasionally been irrational markets. Indeed, the two go hand in hand, because it's precisely when the bulls are stampeding most enthusiastically that people are most likely to get taken for the proverbial ride.
As we've seen in the past year, the path of financial markets can never be as smooth as we would like. Since the current credit crunch began, some stock markets around the world have fallen by as much as 50%. So long as human expectations of the future veer from the over-optimistic to the over-pessimistic, from greed to fear, stock prices will tend to trace a line not unlike the jagged and irregular peaks of the Andes. As an investor, you just have to hope that when you have to come down from the summit of euphoria, it'll be on a nice, smooth ski slope, and not over a sheer cliff. And today, you also have to hope that there's another, safer haven for your money.
As property prices plummet and stock markets crash, more and more investors are turning to the bond market. But are bonds really the answer?
We may think power resides with presidents and prime ministers in palaces and parliaments. Not so. In today's world, real power lies in the hands of an elite group of unassuming men in anonymous open-plan offices. The men who control the world's bond market. Bill Gross is the boss of PIMCO, the world's biggest bond trading operation, which manages a portfolio of bonds worth $700 billion. Gross is widely regarded as the king of the bond market. Just call him Mr. Bond.
Bonds are the magical link between the world of high finance and the world of political power. Governments will always spend more than they raise in taxation, sometimes shed loads more, and they make up the difference by selling bonds that pay interest. But, and here's the magic, if you want to get rid of a bond, the government doesn't have to give you the cash back. You just take it to a bond market, like the one here, Tokyo Stock Exchange, and sell it.
After the rise of banks, the birth of the bond market was the next big revolution in the history of finance. It created a whole new way for governments to borrow money. The bond market funded the wars that plagued northern Italy 600 years ago. It dictated the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo and created the world's greatest financial dynasty. It ensured the defeat of the South in the American Civil War. And in modern times, the bond market has brought once wealthy nations, like Argentina, crashing to their knees. Today, governments and companies use bonds to borrow on an unimaginably vast scale. All told, there are bonds out there worth around $85 trillion.
So with that amount of money at stake, does it really surprise you that the bond market's key player began his money-making career in the casinos of Las Vegas?
I was a blackjack player, one of the first professional blackjack players, not to brag, but in the late 60s, before I went into the Navy, I went to Vegas for 3 or 4 months and applied a card counting system to try and beat Vegas.
Now this master of understatement is the king of the bond market, controller of the biggest bond fund in the world.
So what has this got to do with you, me, and the financial crisis we're adrift in? Well, for a start, the fortunes of most of us, whether we like it or not, are directly linked to the bond market. If the bond market tanks, then down goes the value of our pensions. And that's a huge part of our wealth as individuals.
Bond markets have power because they're the fundamental base for all markets. The cost of credit, the interest rate, the pure interest rate on short-term money and long-term money ultimately determines the value of stocks, homes, all asset classes.
In the financial crisis that has gripped the world since the summer of 2007, US government bonds have been seen as a safe haven for investors seeking shelter from the storm of falling property and share prices.
And when governments borrow money to bail out banks, yes, you guessed it, they have to go to the bond market too.
So if Bill Gross were to lose faith in those bonds, it would hit the financial world like, well, a thunderball. That's why this Mr. Bond has become so much more powerful than the Mr. Bond created by Ian Fleming. And that's why both kinds of bond have a license to kill.
So is there nothing we can do to protect ourselves from plunges in bond markets, real estate markets, and stock markets? Well, actually, yes. There's supposed to be. It's called hedging. To most of us, hedge funds are a mystery. But the one thing we do know is that they can make you stupendously rich. One hugely successful hedge fund manager paid $60 million for this Cézanne, and he owns this Degas too. Not to mention a Jasper Johns he paid $80 million for. He's also given hundreds of millions of dollars to charity. Ken Griffin is the founder of the Citadel Investment Group, one of the world's biggest hedge funds. Last year, he navigated his way through the credit crunch so successfully that he was able to pay himself more than $1 billion. To most of us, risk is scary. But all of Griffin's vast wealth has come because he's found a way of managing risk with a mixture of mathematical precision and brilliant intuition.
It comes down to having to make a judgment call. And good risk managers and good risk takers are individuals that have a history of making good judgment calls in pricing assets or contracts or derivatives in the face of uncertainty.
And is that judgment, when you make it, something that is 99% mathematics, algebra, and 1% intuition, or is the intuition element, the unquantifiable element, bigger than that?
So what I find is that people who are really good at this have great intuition, they have great instinct. Their gut actually tells them something. The mathematics are important because they demonstrate you understand the problem. But ultimately, the decision about whether or not to take a given risk, I think, is really a human judgment call in every sense of the word.
The origins of hedging, appropriately enough, are agricultural. For a farmer, nothing is more important than the future price of his crop after it's been harvested and brought to market. But that could be higher or much lower than he expects. A futures contract allows him to protect himself by committing a merchant to buy the crop when it's brought to market at a price agreed when the seeds are being planted.
The farmer gets a floor below which the price can't sink. The merchant gets a ceiling above which it can't rise. By signing a futures contract, both the farmer and the merchant have hedged their bets.
Both parties are better off, and because of that, the world as a whole is much better off. It encourages capital formation. It encourages investment. It encourages people to do what is needed to be done to make the world a better place.
With the development of a standardized futures contract, agreed rules, and an effective clearinghouse, the first true futures market was born. And its birthplace was here in the Windy City, Chicago. After the city's futures exchange was established in 1874, hedging commodities became standard practice. The next step was for a conditional kind of future to evolve, the option. Some of this really is the financial equivalent of rocket science, but the underlying principle is simple.
Because they're derived from underlying assets, all futures contracts are known as derivatives. But an even smarter kind of derivative is an option. The buyer of a call option has the right, say, to buy a barrel of oil for $120 in a year's time. Now, if the price of oil rises to $150 a barrel, then the option is in the money, and the smart guy makes a profit of $30. But if that doesn't happen, if the price of oil stays the same or actually declines, he's under no obligation to carry through the deal. All he does is to write off the cost of the option itself. Well, it's by buying and selling complex, smart derivatives like options that Ken Griffin has become a billionaire.
In theory, derivatives offer a new way to hedge against an uncertain future. A much smarter way
than boring old insurance, and much more profitable. In the past decade, derivatives have seemed to take over the world of finance. By the end of 2007, the notional value of all derivatives contracts reached a staggering $596 trillion. That's 43 times the size of the American economy.
There are tremendous economic benefits for the people that work here. $20 billion in the hands of 1,000 people is really a 21st century phenomena. This never happened 50 years ago.
Yet as many have discovered to their great cost recently, there are downsides to hedging too.
When billionaire investor Warren Buffett described derivatives as financial weapons of mass destruction, he all but prophesied the downfall of American insurance giant AIG, whose European headquarters are there behind me, brought low not by selling insurance policies, but by selling derivatives that blew up in its face.
The financial crisis has wreaked havoc in the world of hedge funds. One leading manager has predicted that a third of them will simply disappear. Even Riskmaster Ken Griffin's hedge fund lost a fifth of its value in a single month last year as a result of derivative trades that backfired. Few hedge fund managers have survived more financial crises than a man who's been in the business since the early 1970s, the Grand Master of the hedge fund fraternity, George Soros. Born in Hungary, educated in London, and based in New York, Soros has made billions from short selling, a type of dealing which borrows stocks or currencies and sells them for future delivery on the calculation that they'll go down in value.
His biggest coups came from being right about losers, not winners. And the greatest of these was among the most momentous speculative hits in all financial history. On September the 16th, 1992, with the British pound in big trouble, I watched as Soros put out a contract on the Bank of England.
I became convinced that speculators like Soros were bound to win if it came to a straight showdown with the British government. It was a matter of simple arithmetic. $1 trillion of currency traded every day on foreign exchange markets against the meagre hard currency reserves of the UK Treasury.
At that time, the British pound was tightly linked to the German mark through the ERM, the European exchange rate mechanism. As German interest rates rose in the wake of that country's hugely expensive reunification, Britain's rates had to rise too, hurting homeowners and businesses. Soros calculated that the British Chancellor Norman Lamont would be forced to withdraw from the ERM and devalue the pound. It was the biggest bet of Soros's life. So sure was he that the pound would drop that he bet $10 billion, more than the entire capital of his fund.
The risk-reward was disproportionate, and therefore it seemed like a good speculation or investment, if you like, in shorting the pound.
I was equally convinced that sterling would have to be devalued, though all I had to bet was my credibility. That evening, I headed to the opera to see Verdi's The Force of Destiny. It proved exceedingly appropriate. At the interval, they announced that Chancellor Norman Lamont had appeared in the Treasury courtyard to say that Britain was withdrawing from the ERM. How we all cheered.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day. Massive speculative flows have continued to disrupt the functioning of the exchange rate mechanism.
Soros made $1 billion that day, and that was only 40% of his fund's annual profits.
Do you feel, or did you feel a sense of triumph when your prophecy came true and the bet paid off hugely.
And of course, it was like when you're betting and you win, naturally you have that satisfaction and also the profit.
Soros owed his success to a kind of gut instinct about the way the electronic herd would move. But what if Soros was wrong?
What if instinct could somehow be replaced by mathematics? What if you could write an algebraic formula that guaranteed double-digit returns? Well, on the other side of the financial galaxy, such a formula had just been devised.
Imagine that we inhabited another completely different kind of planet to the one Soros believes in. A planet without all the complicating frictions caused by subjective, sometimes irrational human beings. One where the inhabitants instantly absorbed all new information and used it to maximize profits. Where, amid the turbulence of everyday life, all was calm and predictable. In such a perfectly observed, efficiently interconnected world, an unpredicted catastrophic stock market crash would be about as common as an adult shorter than 1.5 feet in our own world. It would happen only once in 4 million years of trading. This was the planet imagined by some of the most brilliant financial economists of modern times. And this is what their planet looked like. In 1993, 2 mathematical geniuses came to Greenwich, Connecticut with a big idea. Stanford University's Myron Scholes had invented a revolutionary new theory of pricing options. He and Harvard's Robert Merton were the original quants, a new breed of speculators using quantitative mathematics to make money. From this nondescript office, they set up a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management and plotted a global financial revolution.
Merton and Scholes' idea was based on the simple option contract. Take the case of a stock that's worth $100 today. Now, suppose I think that stock's going to be worth $200 in a year's time. Wouldn't it be nice to have the option to buy it at today's price in a year's time? If I'm right, I make a tidy profit of $100. But if I'm wrong, well, who cares? It was only an option. The only cost to me is the price of the option itself. The big question is, what should that price be?
$5? $10? The answer was to be found in a magic formula. Quants sometimes refer to this formula as a black box. Well, let's look inside the box. The challenge Merton and Scholes faced was how to price an option to buy a particular stock on a particular date in the future, taking into account the unpredictable movement of the price of the stock in the intervening period. Work that option price out accurately, rather than just relying on guesswork, and you truly deserve the title rocket scientist. With wonderful mathematical wizardry, the quants reduced the price of the option to this formula.
Feeling a little bit baffled? Finding the algebra rather tricky to follow? Well, that was just fine by the quants. In order to make money from this kind of thing, they needed markets to be full of people who had no idea how to price options.
In its first 2 years, Merton and Scholes' company, Long-Term Capital Management, made megabucks by selling options that were never exercised because the buyers had guessed wrong and Long-Term had got it right. They also made a killing by buying up all kinds of different securities that the rocket scientists thought were mispriced.
In Greenwich, the good times were really rolling.
Admittedly, to generate these huge returns, Long-Term had to borrow. This additional leverage or gearing allowed them to bet more than just their own money. By August 1997, the fund's capital was just under $7 billion, but the assets funded by borrowing amounted to $126 billion.
You might have thought that a couple of academics like Merton and Scholes would have been scared silly by this enormous pile of debt, but not a bit of it. According to their magical mathematical formula, there wasn't the slightest risk in being so highly geared. Apart from anything else, Long Term was pursuing multiple, supposedly uncorrelated trading strategies, around 100 in all, with over 7,600 different positions. One of these might go wrong, or possibly even two. But surely all the bets they'd placed couldn't possibly go wrong simultaneously.
Long Term was trading in markets all over the world. But the firm's biggest business was selling options on American and European stock markets. Options that would be cashed in if there were big future stock price movements up or down. At the time, the high prices these options were fetching implied that the markets would become particularly volatile. But Long Term thought this was wrong. According to their calculations, market volatility would actually decline. And that meant the chances of investors exercising their options would be low too. So Long Term piled the options high and sold them cheap. Sounds risky? They estimated their risk of going bust at 1 in 10 to the power of 24. In other words, virtually zero. It was as if they really were on another planet, far from the mundane ups and downs of terrestrial markets. In October 1997, as if to prove that Long Term really was the ultimate brains trust, Merton and Scholes were awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics.
It seemed as if intellect had triumphed over intuition, as if rocket science had taken over from risk-taking. Equipped with their magical black box, the partners in LTCM seemed poised to make money far beyond the wildest imaginings of even George Soros. And then, in the summer of 1998, when every self-respecting hedge fund manager should have been playing with his yacht, something happened that threatened to blow the lid right off the Nobel Prize winner's black box. Reality started to misbehave.
In evolution, big extinctions tend to be caused by outside shocks, like an asteroid hitting the Earth. On Monday, August the 17th, 1998, a giant asteroid smashed into Planet Finance. And, surprise, surprise, it struck on the other side of the world, in an especially flaky emerging market. Weakened by political upheaval, declining oil revenues and a botched privatization, the ailing Russian financial system collapsed. A desperate Russian government was driven to default on its debts, fueling the fires of volatility throughout the world's financial system. Stock markets plunged. Remember all those low-cost options Long Term had sold, based on their prediction of low stock market volatility? The ones they thought no one would ever exercise? Well, now they did. The quants had predicted that Long Term was highly unlikely to lose more than $35 million in a single day. On Friday, August the 21st, it lost $550 million, 15% of its entire capital. Now that, according to the long-term risk models, was next to impossible. The traders in Greenwich stared slack-jawed and glassy-eyed at their screens. It couldn't be happening. But it was. By the end of the month, Long Term was down 45%. The only chance of survival was to find a financial white knight to rescue them.
And the most powerful knight in town was none other than George Soros. It was the ultimate humiliation. The quants from Planet Finance begging for a bailout from the prophet of irrational, unquantifiable reflexivity. That must have been a very tense meeting. Do you remember atmosphere in the room, or am I?
Yeah, I remember he came for breakfast, and it wasn't at all tense because, of course, he was tense, but I wasn't, because I wasn't putting in the money.
There was to be no white knight for long term.
I felt that it was too dangerous and that I didn't have enough capital. And in fact, it really required the coordinated actions of all the banks to bail out LTCM.
And that's precisely what happened. Fearful that long-term's failure could trigger a general financial meltdown, the New York Federal Reserve hastily brokered a multi-billion-dollar bailout by 14 Wall Street banks. What on earth had happened? Why was Soros so right, and the giant brains at long term so wrong?
The long-term capital management was a practical application of the theoretical model of how financial markets operate. And the basic assumption is that markets tend towards equilibrium, and deviations from the mean are random. And therefore you can calculate the odds. And the distribution follows the shape of a bell-shaped curve. And that happens to be plain false.
For one thing, this wasn't a coolly logical planet finance. It was still dear old planet Earth, inhabited by emotional human beings with a stampede mentality. There was, however, another reason why long-term failed. Their risk models were working with just 5 years' worth of data. If they'd gone back even 11 years, they'd have captured the 1987 stock market crash. And if they'd gone back 80 years, they'd have captured the last great Russian default after the 1917 revolution.
To put it bluntly, the Nobel Prize winners had known plenty of mathematics, but not enough history. They perfectly grasped the beautiful theory of planet finance, but not the messy reality of planet Earth. And that, quite simply, is why long-term capital management turned out to be short-term capital mismanagement.
The big question is whether such a crisis is now replaying itself today, 10 years on. Only this time involving so many hedge funds and on such a large scale that it simply can't be bailed out. Well, the answer to that question lies not on another planet, but on the other side of this one.
In our time, we've witnessed the zenith of global finance. In 2006, the world's total economic output was worth around $47 trillion. That's 47, followed by 12 zeros. The total value of stock and bond markets was roughly $119 trillion, more than twice the size. And the amount outstanding of the strange new financial life form known as derivatives was $473 trillion, 10 times larger.
By the summer of 2007, it seemed as if the Earth had turned into planet finance. As never before, the world was interconnected, not just by cables, container ships and jet planes, by 24/7 dealing rooms and international investment banks. Globalization is something we take for granted today, and yet, for all the advantages of an interconnected world, perfectly exemplified by Hong Kong's astonishing, humming container port, there's a downside to globalization, and that is its vulnerability. Its vulnerability to financial shocks, because finance isn't an exact science, and its vulnerability to political forces beyond the control of the bankers.
The ascent of money has seldom been smooth. Time and again, it's been punctuated by big and painful crises. Just 10 years ago, it seemed that these crises were more likely to blow up in emerging markets like Asia. Yet today,
It's the West that's caught up in a full-blown recession, while Asia continues to grow. Indeed, a new phenomenon has come to define the world economy. American borrowers have come to rely on Chinese savers, a symbiotic relationship between China and America that I call Chimerica. But can we be sure that Chimerica will save this era of financial globalization?
The chilling reality is that 100 years ago, another age of financial globalization ended not with a whimper, but with a bang. And there's no reason why that shouldn't happen again in our time. To some, financial history is just so much water under the bridge. Ancient history, like the history of imperial China. Some young traders don't even remember the 1997-98 Asian crisis. In fact, if they came into the markets after 2000, they had 7 bumper years. Stock markets worldwide boomed. So too did bond markets. So did commodity markets. So did derivative markets. In fact, every kind of asset market boomed. And so too did the markets for those products that are in demand when the bonuses are big, like vintage Bordeaux and luxury yachts.
But these boom years were also mystery years. For markets soared at a time of rising short-term interest rates, glaring trade imbalances, and escalating political risk. The key to this seeming paradox lay here, in China. Chongqing, on the banks of the mighty river Yangtze, is deep in the heart of the Middle Kingdom, over 1,000 miles from the coastal enterprise zones most Westerners visit.
Stop is China anti-lock braking system station.
Yet this city is experiencing a most astounding transformation.
I've traveled all over the world making this series, and I must say I have never seen anything like this. Welcome to Chongqing, the fastest growing city in the world. It's construction heaven. If you look over through the fog, you can just about make out one of the 30 bridges they're currently building. And down there, one of the 10 light railways. All around me, there used to be prime farmland until 6 months ago, when they started constructing literally millions of square meters of new office space. The aim is to turn Chongqing into the financial capital of Western China. Well, if they keep this up, it'll soon be the financial capital of the world.
Thanks to growth like this, there are now $345,000 millionaires in China and over 100 billionaires. Not only has China left the colonial era far behind, the fastest growing economy in the world has also managed to avoid the kind of crisis that has periodically blown up in other emerging markets.
One reason for China's crisis-free ascent has been the fact that most Chinese investment hasn't been financed by foreigners, but out of China's own savings. There has been foreign investment, but most of it has been direct investment in the form of things like factories, which you can't easily liquidate and send home in a crisis. Indeed, so enormous have China's savings become in recent years that they've enabled globalization to do the most almighty U-turn. Previously, it was the rich English speakers who lent money to the poor Asian periphery. But now it's the Chinese who are lending money to rich Americans.
This extraordinary place is the Southwestern Stock Exchange. It's where hundreds of Chongqing's residents come to have lunch, play ping pong, and invest, or is it gamble, their savings on the stock market. This is what defines the Chinese economy today. Increasingly, it's what defines the world economy. Chinese investors trying to work out what to do with their abundant savings. After years of instability, Chinese households save an unusually high proportion of their rapidly rising incomes, in marked contrast to Americans, who these days save none at all. So plentiful are Chinese savings that for the first time in centuries, the direction of capital flow is not from west to east, but from east to west. And it is a mighty flow. In 2007, the United States needed to borrow around $800 billion from the rest of the world. That's more than $4 billion every working day. China, by contrast, ran a current account surplus equivalent to more than a quarter of the US deficit. And a remarkably large proportion of that surplus has ended up being lent to the United States. In effect, the People's Republic of China has become banker to the United States of America.
It may seem a little bizarre. The average American has an income of around $44,000 a year, whereas the average Chinese, despite this country's 100-plus billionaires and all the ostentatious signs of new money here in central Chongqing, is on around $2,000. So why would the latter want to lend money to the former, who's roughly 22 times richer? Well, here's how it works.
Until recently, from China's point of view, the best way of employing its vast population was through exporting manufactures to the insatiably spendthrift US consumer. To ensure that these exports were irresistibly cheap, China had to stop its currency strengthening against the dollar by buying literally billions of dollars on world markets. And until recently, this seemed to be to America's benefit too.
Here in America, the best way to keep the good times rolling in recent years has been to import cheap Chinese goods by the container load and sell them in out-of-town superstores like this one. For companies like Walmart, outsourcing to China has been a way of reaping vast profits from cheap Chinese labor. In 2006 alone, Walmart outsourced no less than $9 billion worth of goods from China. But at the same time, by selling billions of dollars of bonds to the People's Bank of China, the United States has been able to enjoy much lower interest rates than would otherwise have been the case. It's what they call at business school a win-win situation.
This is the wonderful dual country of Chimerica, accounting for 33% of the world's economic output and more than half of all global growth in the past 8 years. Chimerica seemed like a marriage made in heaven. The East Chimericans did the saving, the West Chimericans did the spending. But there was a catch. The more China was willing to lend to the United States, the more Americans were willing to borrow. Chimerica, in other words, was the underlying cause of the flood of new bank loans, bond issues, and derivative contracts that swept planet finance after 2000. That, in turn, was the underlying reason why the US mortgage market was awash with cash in 2006, that subprime mortgages were being sold to people with no income, no job, and no assets.
It's convenient for the United States because we've got cheap money. It's convenient for American consumers that wanted to consume. And as their financial position tightened, you had a housing boom, so they felt rich. So richer, anyway. So house prices going up. That's the major asset of individuals. So they borrowed against their house.
It wasn't as if the subprime mortgage crisis of 2007 was hard to predict. Months before it blew up, I was in Tennessee and in Michigan, seeing for myself how many poorer households were heading for mortgage default and foreclosure. What what was much harder to predict was how a small tremor in America's very own homegrown emerging market would cause a financial earthquake all around the world.
In the summer of '07, in June, and even into July, we were in an era of unbridled liquidity and unbridled enthusiasm and unbridled opportunity. The world was as good as it could be. The world was great. The world was growing quickly. And within literally 4 months, we were in a period of almost panic. And that shift, that quick, that fast, on a global scale, is really a new phenomena in some sense.
Not many people foresaw that defaults on subprime mortgages would send such a shockwave around the world that a British bank would suffer the first run since 1866 and end up being nationalised, or that one of the greatest names in American investment banking, Lehman Brothers, would go bust. And not many people saw that as other banks started to write down hundreds of billions of losses, interbank lending would simply seize up, driving the US Treasury to propose a $700 billion bailout for the financial system as a whole.
When one segment of the market collapsed, there was a contagion and other segments of the market became dislocated. And that happened in August of '07. And it spread from one market to another with remarkable speed. And the very core of the financial system was incapacitated.
Certainly, by June 2008, an American recession seemed more or less inevitable. But the end of the world? Looking around the streets of Hong Kong, I don't see much sign of a recession here. Can it be that the Chinese half of Chimerica has successfully decoupled itself from the American half?
Yet the idea that China can somehow walk away unscathed from the current global crisis looks increasingly implausible. Maybe, as its name suggests, Chimerica really is nothing more than a chimera, the mythical beast of ancient legend that was part lion, part goat, part dragon. And maybe there really could be a breakdown of the Chinese-American economic partnership, and an end to the flow of Asian savings to finance the US current account deficit. One of the key points of this film is that the really big crises come just seldom enough to be beyond the living memory of the people who run today's companies, banks, and funds. Just because all the swans you've ever seen are white doesn't mean there are no black swans. Today's financial world is the result of 4 millennia of economic evolution. Yet despite the unprecedented complexity and diversity of the modern financial system, planet finance remains as vulnerable as ever to the age-old problem of booms and busts, irrational herd behavior, and manic depression. Maybe all this complexity has actually increased our vulnerability to crisis.
For 4,000 years, from ancient Mesopotamia to modern China, the ascent of money has been one of the key factors in human progress, an extraordinary story of innovation, intermediation, and integration that have done as much as anything to help people escape from the drudgery of subsistence agriculture. And yet planet finance can never quite escape from the gravitational force of planet Earth, because the quants can never take full account of the human factor, our tendency to underestimate the probability of black swans, our propensity to veer from euphoria to despondency, our chronic inability to learn from history. And that's why the course of financial history, like that most human of emotions, love, never runs smooth and never will, not even here on the magical and quite possibly mythical country of Chimerica.
To find out more about the Ascent of Money and watch the film, visit pbs.org.